Hi. All right. So this is a response to the question in growth-driven design for the Launchpad website. You don't someone pushing back a boss or a client saying that we don't want a smaller site. We want or a site that only has the core features. We want a full, fleshed out site. Um, so there's a few things for those of you who are curious. This is answering a question on a forum. I'll post the link below in the description. So there's a few things to consider here. The first thing is if someone's coming to you saying we want a complete site, the site's, we don't want a half-done site, that is a red flag for some type of thing that sparked that idea in the first place. So there's probably a conversation that happened earlier on in the sales process or earlier on in conversations with your boss that sparked that they were not getting a complete site. So I would backtrack and figure out why they think that in the first place and figure out how, one, you can reset expectations around that, and then two, how can you improve that for future conversations with future people so that you don't have that same issue. The second thing is, there's really, I think some of the people on the forum made this comment, which is exactly right on the money, is that there's no such thing as complete, right? Your website is a living, evolving thing that's always constantly changing, and so we can never really nail down when things are complete. And the other thing is that we also don't, so we don't necessarily know when it's done, but we also don't necessarily know what features or what things we need to build to consider it complete. The best we can do is do our research, try and put together some hypotheses, see what industry standards are, what worked, and put together a guess on what we think those features are. But we really don't know, which kind of goes into my next point, which is the goal of a Launchpad website. So the Launchpad website is, and I have a blog coming out that explains this a little bit more in detail. A Launchpad website is essentially the start of your growth-driven design process. It's not what we think of. We have to kind of step away from traditional website design. Traditional website design, we launch the thing, and we're just so happy that it's over with because it was just such a nightmare. We're like, all right, great, this thing's launched. That's the end. But in growth-driven design, this is the beginning. So the goal of the Launchpad site is to get it out quickly, and the reason is because we want to avoid operating in a bubble. So when we think of the traditional website redesign process, and this is something I would explain, maybe find a more eloquent way to say it, but something I would explain to your prospect if you're an agency or to your boss if you're explaining is, we want to get away from operating within a bubble. And what I mean by that is, the traditional website redesign process, we do our research, maybe we do go out and talk to some people, but then basically our team goes back into the lab and we sit in the back room for basically 2 to 3 months and put together a plan on what we think the best performing site is, and then we end up launching it. But all of that work is being done in the back room, kind of in a bubble, without a ton of user interaction. Now, the better agencies are probably, or the better design people are probably like, oh, well, you do user research and user testing along the way. Totally get it. That's definitely an improvement on that, but it's not. It's still in some ways operating inside of that bubble. And that process is a very your internal team driving that process. And again, we don't necessarily know what the best performing thing is because we're operating within that bubble. The goal of growth-driven design and the goal of a Launchpad site is to get something out there quickly so that we can then change who's driving the features and the things that we're building. Now, by getting it out there and looking at how users are interacting or where they're running into issues, what they're looking for that they're not finding, features that they were hoping were there that weren't, or maybe features that are and that are performing really well and we want to double down on, it then flips and we're no longer operating within this bubble. We're operating within the real world with real users, and it's a user-driven process. The user decides what we should be implementing and what we should be building out next based off of how they're interacting. So if you think about it, if we had, let's say, 3 different features that we wanted to build on the site and we were operating in our bubble, we would have to decide which of those features makes the most sense for us to build, and we would take a guess, an educated guess, but we would take a guess, build it, spend all that time, launch it, and then kind of see, how does the user interact, and hopefully we were right. With this, we can launch possibly quick versions of each one of those 3, or launch one of those ones, and then right away see how the user's interacting with it and make an informed decision on maybe we need to shift and change what we're working on. So again, that's just pointing out the goal of a Launchpad website is to not operate within this bubble. The last thing that I'd like to point out is if you have someone who's worried about having an incomplete site and wants a full-featured site, there's a really easy filtering process you can go through that helps determine what is like a complete site that you could start with. So what you do is after coming out of the strategy phase, you're going to have a laundry list of all your wish list items. These are things that you or other people, whether the client or other people in your organization, have put down on the list of things they want. You put together ideas based off of the qualitative and quantitative research and the analytic audit you've done, and you have this long list of things. You first step of it is you do an 80-20 analysis of all those features that are on that list, and you say what are the 20% of those features that are going to get 80% of the impact, and you pull those 20% to the side. Then you do a second. Step 2 is then you look at those 20% and you say, is this a must-have or is this a nice-to-have? And anything that is a nice-to-have, you pull off of that list and you put back onto your wish list and just put it towards the top of the list for future work. The third filter, now you're left with the 20% that are going to make the impact. They're must-haves. Then you say, is this a must-have for the launch? Is this a must-have for a phase 2, or is this a must-have for phase 3? And you start breaking the project down by phases. So this is what you will have to do if a client's really pushing back or a boss is really pushing back, is start trying to convince them of doing things in phases. And essentially what you're doing is you're essentially just taking what they think is a full big project and by breaking it into phases, they're like acceptable of that. Like they kind of get why phases make sense. But all you're doing is breaking it down into what is your first month and second month cycle going to look like once the site is launched. So you're basically taking that and conforming it into what the growth-driven design framework is anyway. You're just kind of predefining what those first few cycles are going to be. Not the most agile thing in the world, but it's a good way to have kind of like a compromised system where you're still saying, okay, well, if this is what you think a complete site is, or what you think what we need to have, well, let's look at how we can break it into phases, and then at least you kind of have a little bit more of a phased approach that allows you to still launch quickly and then iterate from there. So just some discussion points. Hopefully it helps drive the conversation. If you have any questions or anything like that, comment on the forum thread. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and we'll keep the conversation going. Thanks.